The results are in from the Sunday Independent Ireland Thinks opinion poll for September. Now, this one is significant because we're starting to get near the presidential election, and this is the first time that we've got more than one confirmed candidate and also a new entrant on the Fianna Fáil side. I'm joined by pollster Dr. Catherine Connolly to discuss the findings of his poll. So, as of now, we're still 7 weeks out from the presidential election. We still don't have the full field, and that's a bit of an issue from a polling perspective. What are you telling us in terms of those who are declared and who we think are going to be in the race? How is it shaping up?
So there are three candidates that we asked this particular question on. Heather Humphreys was on 21, Catherine Connolly on 20%, Jim Gavin on 20%, and an enormous 39% said that they don't know between those three figures. It's obviously relatively close when you look at things broken down by gender. Jim Gavin's obviously very strong amongst men. Catherine Connolly stronger amongst women, and there's lots of regional, predictably, variations between the sport. But it really is all even between those three. What's, I think, quite interesting is we asked another question in which we add in Mary Lou McDonald. And for that question, the two, Heather Humphreys retains that lead by 1 point over Jim Gavin on 19 compared to Jim Gavin's 18. But Mary Lou McDonald comes in next at 17% and Catherine Connolly is back at 14. What's clear is that Catherine Connolly, who had been doing relatively well, seems to be doing a little bit weaker now that you have more kind of confirmed candidates. And also what's interesting is that she's now behind a prospective Mary Lou McDonald candidacy.
Yeah, this is based on an assumption that it will be Mary Lou McDonald who is going to be the Sinn Féin candidate. If there is going to be one, we don't know that, but it's just showing what would the impact be of a Sinn Féin heavy hitter on the election. And it does kind of point to that idea that, yeah, a big Sinn Féin name could make a real big impact in this election.
Yeah, and look, we've asked people what their favourite Sinn Féin candidate is, and Mary Lou McDonald does come out, and this is the reason why we choose her to put her in here, is that she does come out significantly ahead of other Sinn Féin candidates. So it is in part obviously her strength as a candidate perhaps, but also a reflection of perhaps the fact that Catherine Connolly's candidacy is kind of weakening a little bit compared to previously, because remember she was ahead of Mary Lou in previous polls that we'd had.
And there's an appetite both amongst the public and particularly Sinn Féin supporters for a Sinn Féin candidate in this election.
Yeah, they prefer to run their own candidate. When we ask the public whether they think there should be a Sinn Féin candidate, or whether we ask Sinn Féin supporters, both believe that Sinn Féin should run a candidate.
What you're looking at there then is if Sinn Féin run a heavy hitter, Catherine Connolly suffers, and the Sinn Féin candidate becomes the leading candidate on the left wing, basically.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. You'd expect her to get the transfers. You'd expect her to do significantly better than Leonie Rita. I'm not sure if other Sinn Féin candidates, I know we've looked at Michelle O'Neill, who would generally be the second most popular Sinn Féin candidate. She tended to be a little bit further out the back.
So what's shifted in this poll is that now that Mairead McGuinness has gone off the pitch,
yeah, exactly,
she was the clear front runner. Everybody was trailing in her wake. She was the one you had to catch up on. You weren't going to do it on the first count. You were trying to do it on transfers and so on. That's entirely changed now, and now it's very much level pegging between everybody.
Yeah, what's very clear as well is even the numbers of undecideds have increased as well in that context, because Mairead McGuinness versus Catherine Connolly presented a certain dichotomy between, an EU-centred candidate and someone who will be kind of a little bit more critical, not necessarily of the EU, I guess, but just a clear dynamic and difference between those two. Now it's much further open, and obviously with Jim Gavin coming in, we've some very interesting data on that. So we asked people who they thought should be the Fianna Fáil candidate, and it was actually pretty close amongst the general public between Jim Gavin and Billy Kelleher, although amongst Fianna Fáil supporters, Jim Gavin was much more popular.
Right, so Micheál Martin will be happy enough there, while Jim Gavin and Billy Kelleher are level pegging in terms of the public at large. In terms of party supporters, they're quite clear. It's Jim Gavin by a 2-to-1 margin is the pick.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, Jim Gavin is performing significantly better than any other Fianna Fáil candidate that we've put into this, and that includes others that have perhaps caused headaches for Fianna Fáil in relation to Bertie Ahern and Mary Hannafin, who did relatively well, or at least better than others, such as Peter Power or others that have kind of been mentioned, or Cynthia Merrick or anything.
There's a couple of things in the data, though, that might cause a few worries about Jim Gavin. One is this male-female divide. He's far more popular amongst men than he is amongst women. So is there a woman problem there from Jim Gavin?
I don't know. I mean, I'd assume in many cases some of this is about the awareness of the candidate, because Jim Gavin will probably be significantly more well known amongst people who might be more likely to follow Gaelic football in particular, and you'd expect that to be the case. He's also more popular in Dublin, so that there's an interesting.
There's yin and yang there, like, yeah.
There's an interesting dynamic here where, in some way, Jim Gavin, Dublin, and also potentially more appealing to like slightly more working class Dublin because of the relative support for the GAA, that does have to block off that putative Mary Lou candidacy that we mentioned earlier. He is very much a competitive candidate. He is arguably on these figures, even though he's only 1 point behind Heather Humphreys, who's going to be more transfer friendly or anything like that. I mean, obviously there's lots of undecideds. Maybe as he becomes more well known amongst women, maybe his support will actually grow much further. We don't necessarily know, but it could go either way. Jim Gavin, I would think right now, even though Heather Humphreys is one ahead, I wouldn't be certain to say that he's not the favourite. I wouldn't be certain to say that Heather Humphreys is the favourite. There's so much undecideds, but also that there really is very little between them.
Now, when it comes to the crunch and what people actually say that they vote on, it points in a particular direction in terms of people with political and legal experience. So what was coming out there in terms of what's the most important factor for people in picking a candidate?
So there's a series of different options. Knowledge of the Constitution was the first one on 42%, followed by political experience on 21%, so very political heavy. Then 12% being an independent, and perhaps some people were saying that because they selected an independent candidate. 7% achievements in the community/sporting world, so you can see a bit of that Jim Gavin vote coming in there. Building relationships with Northern Ireland, 4%. Opinion on Gaza, 3%. Political party, 2%, which actually was a bit of a surprise for me given how closely associated the party supports are with candidates, but however. And then gender, less than 1%, and celebrity status, not a single person actually mentioned that one. So very much politics.
Yeah, so you've got
celebrity.
3 out of 5 people are saying constitution and political experience, that's the biggest thing for us.
Yeah.
So that points to people who are established within the political/legal system, an insider, in other words, not an outsider. And then likewise, you have a question about whether people who want a president who comes from a political background or outside politics. So insider or outsider, what are they saying?
Insider, very much and clearly. So someone with a political background, 52%, someone from outside politics, 20%, and no preference, 28%. So there's clearly a preference for someone with the political knowledge, with the political background. And yet we do have relatively strong support for Jim Gavin again.
Yeah, so what Jim Gavin has to do over the next 7 weeks, assuming he becomes the Fianna Fáil candidate on Tuesday, is convince people that he has got sufficient experience and knowledge of the political legal system and the constitutional requirements for the job in order to carry out the role, where the other candidates, the other major candidates like Heather Humphreys and Catherine Connolly will say, well, listen, I've got political experience. I've been in these positions before.
I think you're right. I think that's going to be the challenge. And people will, obviously, Jim Gavin will be his political views, and people will learn a little bit more about him, I assume, over the next couple of weeks.
Well, you'd have to assume that the Fianna Fáil are keeping him under wraps at the moment, but we've yet to wait and see what exactly are Jim Gavin's political views.
You could argue that this sort of strategy, the celebrity strategy, has worked well in some respect in relation to the European candidacies. You had some candidates that didn't necessarily appear as much in media and still got elected, who were kind of celebrities perhaps. So celebrity as a strategy, worked relatively well for the European elections. There were a number of candidates, such as perhaps Nina Carberry, who might not necessarily have been under massive political scrutiny in terms of her political beliefs. But obviously, a presidency is going to be very different. We expect at least one, if not two, political debates. We expect far more scrutiny over this particular position than an individual running in a region in the European elections.
Yeah, a European election is a candidate in a race in very many races, so, whereas this is very much the focus is only on the contenders in one contest. What about any independents other than Catherine Connolly, obviously?
Yeah.
People who might have to go down the county council route of getting a nomination, or independents who are coming from the outside trying to get an Oireachtas nomination here. You tested out some of those names. What came back?
So of them, and there's a long list of names, and to some extent there's going to be overlap in terms of the support for some of these candidates, because quite a number of them will come from a slightly more right-wing, and in many cases much further right-wing perspective, so their votes kind of overlap with one another. But Bob Geldof is clearly, of them, the more significant in our poll. Now, obviously, this includes undecideds of 19% of this particular question. Bob Geldof was on 7%. Maria Steen was on 3%. Then you had Conor McGregor on 2%, Nick Delahanty on 2%, Peter Casey on 1%, Garrett Sheridan on 1%, Joanna Donnelly, who's obviously out of the race, on 1%, and Michael Flatley has also pulled out, was on less than 1%.
Okay, so of those then, Geldof is the only one who's kind of really getting any significant traction.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Geldof is arguably, well, perhaps Conor McGregor is obviously similarly well known, but Bob Geldof and Conor McGregor are very well known. Conor McGregor obviously not as popular as Bob Geldof. Perhaps Geldof could find a route somehow. I'm not sure whether it's through the councils or
the Oireachtas,
through the Oireachtas. I mean, the Oireachtas is all sewn up in relation to
so you hope
Connolly at the minute.
And let's not get carried away either.
Yeah.
Geldof holds his own, but ultimately Heather Humphreys, Jim Gavin, Mary Lou McDonald, Catherine Connolly, they'd still be way
They're
ahead
still
of
well
him.
ahead, yeah.
So while his name is floated out there, okay, he'd have to come out and officially declare, he'd have to seek a nomination, he'd have to start campaigning, but he's got a platform to build on, whereas the rest, nah.
Yeah, certainly the ones that have been around. I mean, Peter Casey has been around for quite a bit. Garrett Sheridan, I don't think his campaign's necessarily going anywhere. Conor McGregor, obviously we know we've polled Conor McGregor I think 100 times, and he still has some support, although it's tiny. And Maria Steen obviously doing better than Conor McGregor is interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say that she's particularly well known compared to McGregor, or indeed perhaps even she might be less well known than Nick Delahanty. She perhaps also has some sort of route, but she is a little bit behind. I mean, she's only on 3%, so that's not much. But what I'd say in relation to those figures is that you've got so many figures here that have very similar support bases that they do overlap a little bit. You'd imagine the Nick Delahanty vote and the Conor McGregor vote and Peter Casey vote is quite similar, and perhaps Maria Steen as well.
Okay, so it's a big ask there. I mean, if the big parties are telling their councillors not to nominate people via the council route, there's nobody really battering the door down here and saying, democracy dictates that I be on this election ticket and you're preventing me from becoming president.
No, but who knows, someone else might come out of the woodwork and, there's more popular celebrities out there, I think,
of the next week. Okay, so all told, still very open. Mairead McGuinness's departure from the contest has opened up the field. The candidates who we think are going to be running are very much neck and neck, but the Sinn Féin candidate, whoever that is, could be a game changer, or at the very least will play a significant role in the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so we look forward to your next poll in October. So start of October with the election coming up on October 24th. We'll have a fair picture then at that stage of exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have a better ballot. We're going to have more scrutiny. We're going to have more media attention again further, and that will obviously consolidate things. I'd hope that the undecideds will fall from 39%, because that is at a level, as I said before, which is similar to the sorts of figures that we had around the referendum, which just made it impossible to tell what people were going to do. But yeah, we look ahead to the next poll, obviously.
Okay. And you can read all about the poll, the figures, the stats, the analysis in the Sunday Independent and the Irish Independent online.